Hello, my name is Hayley and I work for the Royal Horticultural Society. So, the RHS is a charity that's all about gardening. So, trying to get everyone to enjoy gardening, whether that's, in their gardens at home, in their allotments, in their school gardens, in little green places in the community, anywhere where a little bit of gardening could happen, we want to help people to do that and to enjoy that, and I work in the plant health team. Now, plant health is all about pests and diseases, and I'm going to talk a bit more about these words in a second to try and understand what they might mean. So, I'm an entomologist. An entomologist is a type of scientist who studies insects, but actually, any kind of garden animal tends to come under the work that my team does and the things that we know about. So I'm going to talk about some of these pests and diseases. But first, I wanted to go back to the definition. What is a pest? Now, you might have heard this word used before. Sometimes it's just used to describe a person or a thing that's annoying. The definition really is about anything that causes a problem for humans, but it's not clear cut. There's lots and lots of things that could be considered a pest in one setting, but actually not a problem or even beneficial in another. So I've got three example pictures here on the slide of things that could be considered a pest. So the first one is a rabbit. Now, perhaps if you had a golf course, you would be annoyed if there were rabbits eating the grass, digging in the grass, pooping in the grass. That would be to you a pest. But I'm sure many of you actually enjoy seeing rabbits. You find them beautiful. Many people have rabbits as pets. So they're something that people really enjoy seeing. So it's definitely not easy to say whether or not they are a pest. Um, the one in the middle is a piece of wood with lots of little holes in it, and these holes have been caused by a death watch beetle. Now, that's a very dramatic name because when people lived in houses which were mostly made out of wood or had big wooden beams, then having these beetles eating in your wooden beams was something that is really scary, could cause a big problem. But actually, out in the wild, this isn't a problem at all because when a tree has fallen down, all these beetles and lots of other creatures need to break down and recycle that wood so that it's not just sitting there forever. So, in a natural ecosystem, it's definitely not a problem. It's beneficial. And then my final example here is the hornet. So this is the biggest type of wasp that we have in the UK, and lots of people don't like them because they're big, they are buzzy, and they can sting. So people find them really scary. But if you're a gardener, these actually are really helpful creatures to have around. The hornet isn't very aggressive. It won't sting you unless you kind of try and get too close to the nest or if you try and catch them. Otherwise, they're just going to go about their business, which is being a predator. So the hornets will hunt caterpillars and some of the other creatures we're going to talk about in a minute that eat your plants, and they all help to keep their numbers balanced. So at the moment, we talk about pests and diseases, but we need to always be aware that the word pest isn't that helpful. Everything exists in a complicated food web, in an ecosystem, and it's not just about kind of what humans want. Everything is in its own balance. So, back to the title of my talk. I've called it Plant Munchers and the Garden Ecosystem. So, I'm going to talk about some animals and also some other types of organisms that will feed on the plants in your garden. Things that, if you're really trying to grow plants, you might find annoying. So at the end, I'm going to talk a bit more about the things you can do to try and reduce the problems that these creatures can cause in an environmentally friendly way that helps to make a nice balanced garden ecosystem. So I've divided these things into a few different categories, and the first category is things that chew. So humans eat plants, so do lots of other animals. And normally, when you think about eating plants, you think about just kind of biting and chewing those leaves or other bits of the plants and eating them. And the big one, the one that people often ask us questions about, is slugs. So in the UK, it's quite damp, and so slugs, they find it a pretty good place to live. They need to stay damp to live. Um, and they like to eat lots of different plants, but especially things with soft leaves like lettuce or hostas, which is this picture of the leaf with the holes in it. But some slugs can also bore into potatoes underneath the ground and eat all kinds of things. Now, slugs is a group of animals. We have more than 40 types of slug in the UK, and some of them, so like the ones at the top, are the grey field slug, and they're fairly small, but they do like to eat plants, especially soft things like lettuces that we want to grow. So they can be very annoying. But actually, more than half of those 40 something species are not eating live plants, or they don't prefer to eat live plants. They'd rather eat the dead leaves that have already kind of started to fall off the plants, or eat fungi and other rotting material. So lots of slugs are good to have in the garden. They are recycling those nutrients back into the ecosystem. But even the ones that really do like to eat your precious lettuce plants that you're trying to grow, they're important as well because they are part of a food web, and there's lots of other creatures that like to feed on them, especially things like birds and frogs and ground beetles. So they're all part of the food chain. Right, our next chewing type of thing is caterpillars. I'm sure you've seen lots of caterpillars before. We actually have more than 2,500 different types of caterpillars in the UK. And they all turn into beautiful butterflies and lovely moths. So you can't have those beautiful creatures if you don't have the caterpillars getting all the energy by eating plants. And most of them, so these ones on the left-hand side underneath the caterpillar title, um, most of them they might eat quite a lot of leaves, but the things that they eat should survive without too bad effects from being nibbled on. There's only a few caterpillars that tend to happen in such high numbers that they can really start to hurt the health of the plants. And the one that I've thought to show here is the box tree moth. So on the right hand side, we've got this rather pretty black and white moth and its green caterpillar. And it feeds on box. Box is a small little hedge plant. We often trim them into little square shapes or sometimes topiaries. So they're often part of quite kind of formal old-fashioned gardens, quite an important part. And this moth isn't originally from the UK. It comes from the other side of the world. And when it was accidentally brought over to Europe, it started to spread. And it feeds on our box plants, and the caterpillars occur in such high numbers that over the course of a few days, sometimes your little square hedge can lose all of its leaves. And this is a big problem. It's often the case that creatures that come from the other side of the world or further away, they tend to cause more problems. And this could be because there's not so many of the predators that they would have in the place where they normally occur to keep their numbers down. And we think that's what's happened with the box tree moth. It doesn't have as many things feeding on it, but hopefully birds and other things in our gardens will be able to keep them under control in the end. But this is something where if you see it, you probably do want to try and remove some of these caterpillars because otherwise you might not have any box plant left. Right, our last chewing type of creature is beetles. And here I want to talk a bit about something I've kind of mentioned, which is whether something is a specialist or a generalist. So a specialist is something that only feeds on one type of plant or just a few very closely related plants. So for example, this bright red beetle is called a lily beetle and it eats lilies. And that's all it eats really. So it is a specialist. The one below it, the bluey green beetle, is an alder leaf beetle. And this eats alder, but it also eats quite a few other types of trees as well. So it's a bit more of a generalist. And then the big one on the right-hand side, this is the vine weevil. And this is really a generalist. It can eat almost any kind of garden plant. What you'll often see is shrubs, so small trees will have their leaves eaten with these kind of notches taken out of the side, quite a distinctive shape that they chew. And this isn't too much of a problem for the plants, but the problem with the vine weevil is the larvae, the young beetles, they live underground and they feed on plant roots. And so for small plants that have not got a lot of roots, like strawberry plants or primulas, they can actually eat so much of the roots that the plants die. So in this case, although you would maybe see the beetle eating above the ground, it's the below ground that you need to look out for. And I'm going to talk at the end about the kinds of things you can do to help with these types of problems. My next category of things that might be eating your plants is things that suck. So rather than kind of chewing big bites out of the leaves that are really obvious, what these types of creatures do is that they use their straw-like mouth parts to pierce the plant and to sip the sap. So the sap is kind of like the blood of the plant. It's all the sugary water that goes through the plant and gives it all of its energy. They put their mouth parts into that and drink it. So they're taking away a bit of the plant's energy. And this picture shows an aphid. There's lots and lots of different types of aphid in the UK. They are pretty small, so kind of up to a centimetre big normally. They have fairly soft bodies for insects, and they reproduce really, really fast. So that aphid that we saw on the big picture is giving birth to another aphid, and then that tiny aphid will probably be ready in just a couple of weeks to give birth to its own aphids. So if you get one aphid landing on your plant, you can soon get lots and lots. And one particular type of aphid I wanted to show was the rosy apple aphid. So these two bottom pictures show a couple of the different colour forms of that aphid. And you can see they're on the underside of the leaf, and there's absolutely loads of them because they can reproduce so fast. And as well as kind of inserting their mouth and taking sap out of the plant, often aphids will leave some of their saliva behind, which can damage plant cells. And in this case, it causes the leaves to curl. Sometimes you will see very tightly curled leaves, and if you open up, you will find these aphids inside. So yeah, they can cause some problem by taking the energy of the plant and causing this leaf curling. But aphids are really tasty. Lots of things will eat them because they're so soft. They're very easy to eat. So again, at the end, we'll talk about some of the things that will come and eat them for you. Our next sapsucker is shield bugs. So we have nearly 50 types of shield bug in the UK, but most of them you'll never notice any effect that they have by taking the sap from plants. There's just a few that can cause problems. The problem here is often identification. So this photograph shows two different species, the common green shield bug, which is native to the UK, and that's the one with the brown wingtips. And the southern green shield bug on the right there, this is a one that's arrived new to the UK and has become more of a problem. And the main reason it causes a problem is it will feed on vegetables like beans as they're forming and cause them to be distorted and not grow well, and you won't get a good harvest of beans. Right, and our last sapsucker is thrips. Now, the word thrips is interesting because thrips with an S on the end is the word for whether you have one of them or many of them. So a thrips or some thrips will feed on your plant. Now, these are quite tiny. So I've shown the glasshouse thrips here, the picture on the right taken with a microscope. They grow up to 2 millimeters big, and you can see they've got kind of a sausagey body and they've got 6 legs. They are tiny insects. And the pale yellow ones are the young, and the dark ones with the white stripe are what the adult thrips look like, and the white stripe is actually their wings. Now, because they're so small, you might not see them feeding on the plant, but they do the same thing. They pierce the plant with their mouth, and they make a kind of a mottly speckling pattern on the leaf. And in this leaf picture, you can also see the black specks, which is their poop. So you'd probably see those symptoms happening first, and you might need to get your magnifying glass out to know that it had been caused by glasshouse thrips. Now, they're called glasshouse thrips because they used to mostly be found inside in glasshouses or on houseplants, but in recent years we've seen them more and more outside, and this is probably to do with climate change. Okay, the next category of things that are affecting your plants that I'm going to talk about are things that make spots. So these are some of the plant diseases. So like we can get a cold or a chicken pox, plants can get diseases too. And these are normally caused by organisms such as fungi and bacteria and viruses. Normally things where you won't see the actual organism unless you have a microscope, but you will see the effects that they have on the plant. And the first spot that I'm going to talk about is pear rust. Now, you probably, if you can find any pear tree, you'll be quite likely to see some of these spots. It's called rust because the spots are bright orange, and it's a type of fungus that grows inside the plant cells. And if you flip these spotty leaves over, you can see on the picture on the bottom middle there is a kind of a lumpy growth. And this is a fruiting body, which is a bit like a mushroom growing on the leaf. And that's where it releases its spores from. So for fungus, spores are kind of like seeds. That's how it spreads and goes to affect new plants. Now, this spot looks kind of dramatic, especially that picture on the left where it's got loads and loads of spots. But actually, they don't take much energy from the plant, so it's not normally something that you would need to act on. The next spot is rose black spot. Now, again, as with the pear, if you can find some roses, you can probably find some rose black spot. It's a very common disease for roses to have. It's also a fungus. Sometimes the leaves will just have a few little pale purpley spots, but sometimes they will be covered in spots. And the more you get towards this picture on the right-hand side, where more of the leaf is spotty than is green, then that's when it starts to affect the plant's health. If the leaf gets too covered with spots, often the leaves will fall off. And that means the plant doesn't have its green area to help it photosynthesize, to help it make energy. Now, for this one, there's not much that you can do except to keep things tidy. So we've talked about fungus spreading their spores. If fallen spotty leaves can be taken away and put in the compost or otherwise tidied away, then that means there's fewer spores kind of going back up to affect the plant later or affect other plants nearby. And my last spotting thing is called powdery mildew. So this is also a fungus, but rather than growing inside the cells, this one grows mostly on the surface of the leaf. You can see it looks kind of like a white mold, like you might get on bread. It's not the same type of fungus, but it is similar. It will spread across the leaf. It will grow a little bit inside, but mostly on the surface. And you often get this particular one shown in the photos is often found on squash plants. So if you're growing pumpkins or squashes, you'll be quite likely to see this. And it can block out the sun for the leaf, so minimize the amount of energy and take some of the energy from the leaves. And it prefers it when there's a lot of moisture in the air. So one of the ways you can prevent or slow down this fungus is by making sure your plants are nice and spread out and that the leaves aren't all kind of clustered, jostling together. If you can take some leaves out to allow the air to flow through, then this will be less likely to be a problem. And my final category of things is another set of diseases, things that rot. So this is things that cause the plant to break down from the inside. Now, the big one here is honey fungus. This is the disease that we get the most inquiries about, people asking how to stop it causing problems in their garden. This is another fungus, but it spreads through the soil and then it grows inside trees and other plants and rots them from the inside. And you might see these mushrooms in the autumn time, but most of the year the fungus is growing away inside the plant and you wouldn't necessarily see it, but you might see the tree starting to get sick. If you get this in your garden, there's not much you can do apart from remove plants that are affected and try and plant plants that are less affected. So on the RHS website, we have a list of plants that do not suffer as much from this disease. My next rotting disease is called tomato and potato blight. This is not a fungus. It's a similar type of thing to a fungus, but it's actually called an oomycete. And it rots the plants from the inside. It spreads on the wind and spreads through the plants, and it causes this kind of quite sick-looking blackening of the stems, and it affects the fruit as well, which is very annoying if you're trying to grow tomatoes. It can also go down into potatoes. It tends to happen late in the summer. So if you can harvest your tomatoes, your potatoes early enough, they might not be affected. And it's much worse in warm, wet weather. So some years it will be a problem and some years it won't. And my last rotter is called sulfur tuft. Now, this looks similar to honey fungus. It makes this kind of creamy coloured mushroom. The picture on the right actually shows a honey fungus mushroom on the left, the bigger mushroom that's upside down, and a sulfur tuft on the right. And it looks very similar, and it does rot wood, but it's actually not a problem because it can't get into healthy trees the way that honey fungus can. Most of the mushrooms that you will see will be rotting wood that is already dead. So branches that have fallen off, or a tree maybe that's really sick already. And so again, these ones aren't actually causing a problem. They're kind of helpful because they are recycling. So if you want to help your garden plants or the vegetables on your allotment to stay healthy and not die, what can you do? And the answer is you need to make a healthy garden ecosystem. So you can't just zoom in on the one problem that's affecting the plant. You need to step back and see everything. And the first step in that is having happy plants. So plants are much stronger and resilient if they are healthy. They will be less affected by these pests and diseases. So you need to research your particular type of plant and make sure it's getting just the right amount of sunlight, of water, of food, and whether the soil is right for it. And yeah, different plants can have very different needs. So you do need to do your research to make your plant as healthy as possible. And then when it comes to garden pests and diseases, you need to have a little bit of a plan. So the first thing is biosecurity. Now, what this basically means is stopping things from coming in. So if you're buying new plants, check them over before you bring them in to see that they're healthy. Because if they're not, they might bring in things that will affect the plants you've already got. Lots of problems might be a bit annoying, but aren't going to cause a big problem. And that's what tolerate means. It means that, that's a bit annoying that my roses have got spots on, but it's not really doing anything too bad. So I will just let it be. And then we have the more things where you can get involved. So barriers, this picture with the copper ring around the plant is to try and discourage slugs and snails from getting in. And this kind of thing, if it can work, is ideal because it's not hurting the slugs or snails, it is just stopping them from eating your plant. And the same, the bottom picture with the plastic bottles, that's called a cloche. So when your plants are very small, when they would really suffer if they got nibbled by something, then can you just put a physical barrier to protect them until they get a bit bigger and stronger? And then we have more complicated things like biological control. This is when you basically bring a predator in. And the one on the Nema slug, that's the picture on the bottom left, that is a parasite of slugs that you can buy and mix with water and add into your vegetable bed to help stop the slugs from eating your lettuces. And then we want to briefly talk about pesticides. So this is what people would often think to reach for first because it tends to be easier. Things like slug pellets, people want to just put them down and the slugs will eat them and the slugs will die and then your problem is solved. But it is not actually a good idea because the problem is that those effects on the slugs can carry through to other creatures in the food web. And the same if you're spraying any pesticides on your leaves, that will affect all of the insects, good and bad. And so it is not something that we actually recommend now. You can make a strategy from all these other techniques so that you don't have to resort to pesticides. But ideally, you wouldn't have to act much because your garden ecosystem would be healthy. And that's where the natural predators come in. So there's lots of predatory creatures, the ones that you probably have seen eating before, like the big ones like the birds and the badgers, but also frogs. Things like wasps and hornets, they are predators. And also the picture in the bottom middle, that's a ground beetle. There's lots of different types of ground beetle, and most of them are predatory. We've got earwigs here, slow worms. That's the snaky looking one in the middle. And then the top right, ladybirds. Ladybirds love to eat aphids. And there's just a huge, huge number of predators that are out there, and they want to eat all the creatures in your garden. And if you have enough of them, then your garden will be in balance because the plant-eating ones will always be kept down to a sensible level by the ones that eat them, like in any food web. But how can you get to a point where all these wild ones are doing the job for you? And that's not necessarily that easy. You can't just kind of write them a letter and invite them to come and live in your garden and eat your aphids. You need to make your garden as friendly for them as possible. And that means having lots of different types of plants, having tall plants, short plants, trees and shrubs, and small herbaceous plants, and making it not too tidy so that there's lots of hiding places, having some long grass, having some piles of leaves, having some piles of logs is definitely a good one. And also having a pond. If you want those frogs and toads to come and eat the caterpillars and the slugs, you need to have somewhere for them to live. So you making your garden as wildlife friendly as possible will make it more likely to be that healthy, balanced ecosystem where no one herbivore comes and eats all your plants and dominates. So I've tried to cover quite a lot of information here. If you want to learn more, you can go on the RHS website and look in our advice section, which has lots of web pages on how to grow different types of plants and what to do about the different problems that you might encounter. And you can also sign up for the RHS campaign for school gardening, which has lots of activities and advice that's really aimed at schools. So I hope that you have learned something and have enjoyed hearing about the plant munchers in your garden and what you can do about them. And thank you very much for your time.